Peter is the most prominent of Jesus' disciples. He has this impulsive personality. He doesn't play safe, but just goes for it. He is the first to follow Jesus, and he doesn't hesitate to throw the nets on the other side of the boat when Jesus tells him to. And when Jesus invites him to walk on water, Peter doesn't hesitate, but he gets out of the boat. And yet in many ways, we too are just like Peter, full of faith and enthusiasm and a desire just to go and do it. Peter's strength was that he did not play safe. He just went for it. And yet this impulsive personality is not just his strength, but his weakness, a stumbling block which so easily trips him up. At the Last Supper, we are told a dispute arose among the disciples, and they argued among themselves who was considered to be the greatest. And while they were arguing, Jesus responds by saying, "This very night you will fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." But Peter, with his impulsive nature, passionately objects to Jesus using these iconic words, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." Even if all the other disciples run, Peter is absolutely certain that he will stick with Jesus no matter what. And yet in a matter of hours and rooster crows, Peter, like the other disciples, does not just fall away, but he goes one step further, completely disowning Jesus, not just once, not just twice, but 3 times, denying that he ever knew him. So what was it that turned Peter from being an enthusiastic disciple, somebody who was all out for Jesus, to somebody in the next moment who would completely disown him? The answer to that question is simply that Peter's boldness and enthusiasm are not being stress tested. In the world of engineering, the term stress test is an act of putting something under so much pressure to see if or when it will fail. It's an important exercise to see how one can assess how strong something really is. In the late 1960s, a company called Freeman Fox built a massive bridge across the Yarra Bridge in Victoria, Australia. And this bridge is now known today as the Westgate Bridge. Spanning over 1.5 miles, it is the 5th longest bridge in the country. The bridge was designed to be strong, enduring and capable of carrying a 5-lane motorway on what is one of Australia's busiest routes. Pay attention to what happened shortly after.
Some of them was a bit nervous, I think. Some of them thought, well, it shook a lot, because they were taking out the bolts that morning.
I was just down by Pier 10, sitting on the crane, and then there was like a gun being fired several times overhead, like a crack, 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 crack. I seen the engineer falling down right in front of me, actually, right in front of the crane, and one of the guys fell to the left and another guy to the right of me. You never forget that day, actually.
It was absolute terrible time, when you start looking back and seeing 35 men losing their lives. There's 35 families, sons, daughters, wives, partners. When you look at that and see the devastating effect that that's had on friends, It's just horrific. A lot of good friends were killed. A lot of families were devastated.
On paper, the bridge was strong, but in reality, when exposed to the stresses of the real-world environment, its true strength was tested, and in this case, it catastrophically failed. The structural engineering company Freeman Fox thought this design of bridge was invincible, strong, safe, but only once tested under the stress of the real-world environment was its faults and weaknesses clearly exposed. And in reality, Peter was like this bridge. Within his own understanding, he is all out for Jesus. He will never turn his back on him. He will never abandon him. But that commitment is yet to be tested under stress. And while Matthew's Gospel records Jesus telling Peter he was going to disown him, Luke in his Gospel gives us more detail, with Jesus saying, "Simon, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have returned back, strengthen your brothers." The impending attack, according to Jesus, was Satan's work. From Satan's perspective, he is out to destroy Peter and his credibility. But from Jesus' perspective, he allows this attack as an opportunity for Peter not to be destroyed, but to be stress tested, which ultimately would result in Peter being purified and strengthened. Sifting is a process that wheat has to go through if it is to be edible. It is the act of pounding the seed so that the inedible chaff surrounding the seed will be broken up and separated, so that in turn the good, wholesome, edible grain underneath can be exposed and used. And in this case, among other things, the chaff in Peter's life was his impulsive ego, his inability to see his own weakness, and that chaff needed to be dealt with. If Peter is going to be the disciple Jesus intends him to be, that chaff needs to be removed. It's interesting how when we think of the case of Peter, or even the case of the Westgate Bridge, we often disassociate ourselves. We often think we'd never be like him, or what happened in Victoria could never happen here. But here's the catch. Freeman Fox, who built the bridge in Victoria, also built another bridge at the same time of the exact same design, and that bridge is called the Erskine Bridge. What happened there could have so easily happened here. And the reality is what happened to Peter can so easily happen in our own lives. The reality is that we can all be like Peter. And like Peter, there are times when we abandon the Lord in different ways. Times when we fail, we mess up. Times when we are just left incredibly disappointed because what we planned isn't the way it worked out. These are times when we are often sifted. These are times when we find ourselves weak and our failings and our recognition that we need to change. Many years ago I felt God calling me to pastor a church. For years I could not shake off that calling, and for decades it just stayed with me. And so after completing a 3-year course in theology, I was given the opportunity to lead a small church in Elderslie, and some of you were part of that church. I came to that church with enthusiasm, ideas, vision for what we as a church could do. But to cut a long story short, after 4.5 years, we closed the church and we went our separate ways. Things didn't work out the way I expected them to. And while we felt it was right to do that, and the timing was right, nevertheless there was that question: how much was that down to circumstances? And how much of closing that church was down to me? How much was my lack of experience, maybe not having all the skills required, taking the church from where it was to where it could have been? And so after the church closed, I met up with a pastor friend, and as we sat down and talked about what happened, he told me about a well-known church leader in America who says, I will never take anyone on my team unless he has failed at least 4 times. And that's because for him, failure is not a mistake, but failure is an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to grow, an opportunity to address what needs to change so that in Christ we become stronger, so that God can use us more powerfully than he did before. And in a similar way, because Peter failed Jesus that day, this gave him the opportunity to address what needed to change so he could become a more effective disciple and be used in a way in the future that he never imagined was possible before. The bridge in Australia failed. As a result of that failure, engineers made changes to this bridge to prevent that happening here. Peter failed, and yet Jesus didn't throw in the towel with Peter. And we'll see how this plays out later in the series. You and I have our shortcomings, and yet it's in these moments of being human, coming back to Jesus, that our hearts are gradually refined, ever so slightly, to resemble being a little bit more like Jesus. This is why Jesus died for us, and this is why we're in constant need to come to him.